Anthony Davis, it amazes me that there is this disproportionality in the evaluation of these two presidential candidates. It's a remarkable thing. And I'm wondering, I think you bring some unique perspectives because you do come from Europe, And and you've been here a while, but I still think that you kind of have a fresh perspective. Would this ever exist in, let's say, a European election, a British election, et cetera? This kind of total disregard almost for the fascistic tendencies of one of the candidates, to the point that we're now just focusing on how many interviews Kamala Harris has done.
Well, I don't think it would ever have got this far. Certainly in the UK, definitely in countries like Germany or Sweden, the functioning democracies of this world. And the reason I say that is because Trump should probably not have got the nomination in 2016 because he was a joke character. And whilst there are obviously a lot of people voted for him, they were voting for the guy off The Apprentice. Well, the marketing manager from The Apprentice has now come forward and apologized for creating this fake character of a rich billionaire with all the helicopter and the boardroom. I mean, apparently Donald Trump's boardroom was so shabby that they had to build a boardroom in a studio because his kind of day-to-day business life was not up to it. So they invented a character that people voted for. And I can totally see that. America does celebrate its entertainers. In England, we have kings and queens going back thousands of years. Here, you have Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. And so I get that, and I love that. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to move here, But the problem is that when you get that crossover, it's almost like if Frank Sinatra showed up and he couldn't sing. This is the issue, right? That Donald Trump was never the real deal. He was an actor. He played the role of a president or a presidential type businessman, president of the Trump organization, but he never ran it like that. It was a family business, like a mafia business where he was the Don, literally. And nobody liked working for him. And so what the network had to do was create an image of somebody where this TV show would sell. And of course, the TV show is one of the great TV success stories. However, it doesn't work in real life. And I think in the UK, and just to your question, and in Europe, people would have seen through the character played on TV much earlier. And therefore, that whole golden escalator thing, which, he keeps focusing on, it's like for him, that was it was like a coming of age, coming down his golden escalator, where for the first time in his life, he actually was having to do something for somebody else and to be held accountable and to work within rules and protocols. He'd never done that before in the Trump organization. So this is really where we're at now, with the media realizing they could get rich off of him because he's a freak show, and with everybody kind of thinking, well, regular politicians haven't managed to do any good for us, so let's try the guy off The Apprentice. This is the saddest part of the story, right? Because he played that role, didn't he? He was like, I'm not a politician. But what we should have said is, no, you're not a politician, so clear off.
Well, I mean, he's not a he
he's
didn't
not
know
a
how
public
to govern.
servant.
I mean, he didn't know how to govern as a public servant. Exactly. I'm so glad you mentioned it that way because even this is coming across. I'm seeing not woke who kind of likes to stir the pot. But hey, is Kamala more qualified? Every flavor of yes. She
has
more
experience
qualified.
in all three branches of government. And let's not forget that. He had no experience in Washington. He claimed he'd only ever been there 17 times and never stayed over.
And that was a kind of seductive pitch for those who were frustrated with Washington, that here's this outsider who's going to come shake it up. And this is the other thing. He has been a president now, says Not Woke. Yeah, he was a president who was feckless, incompetent, fired everyone, denied the existence of COVID. I mean, I say fired everyone because he was firing everyone who was pushing back on him in any kind of responsible way. He denied the existence of COVID, and it costs hundreds of thousands of lives at minimum. And Anthony Davis, you detail this so beautifully. I mean, you go down like the laundry list of things. But here's a guy who engineered a coup on the United States of America. He tried to overturn the election, and you still want to tell me that he has been president now? So he has been president. He's been a guy who sat in the executive office and tried to overthrow the government of the United States. I cannot even conceive that this guy is literally in a dead heat with anybody else in America in the race for president.
We shouldn't even have to consider him as a candidate. It should be an automatic disqualification. If you try and overthrow the government and overturn a legitimate election and steal classified documents and pretend that you've given them back when you haven't and then share them with an Australian billionaire, not to mention anybody else, it should be automatic disqualification. And this is the problem with the United States, is that the guardrails, clearly the founders had a system that worked in the early 1900s, but it didn't necessarily work, or doesn't necessarily work today. They weren't expecting somebody like Donald Trump to kind of take advantage of this. So clearly, we are in a situation now, I would actually call it a constitutional crisis, where you have an insurrectionist running for president, and according to the polling, he's neck and neck. I mean, I've been checking the poll of polls every day, and it's getting closer and closer and closer. She's like 1.5 points ahead now. This is margin of error stuff.
Absolutely right. And there's this. This is interesting. And then I'll get into the disproportionality a little bit more. And I also want to show you this Stephen A. clip. Trump is a Russian asset, says Renee. When are people going to realize that? I truly believe he has a plan to top off this government and make it an autocracy. And all the autocrats of the world are in on it. I mean, I don't know if all the autocrats are. I mean, I think the autocrats of the world are rooting for him. There really might be a connection between Trump and Russia. He's been almost remarkably and eerily scared, or I don't know what you would call it, disdainful of any notion that Putin be criticized in any way, from Ukraine to meddling in the election to, I mean, it's as though, I mean, I get why he wouldn't want to say he meddled in the election in 2016, because that would suggest it undermines the legitimacy of his victory. But he is so completely as I say, almost frightened of criticizing Vladimir Putin, that it does make me wonder if there isn't some connection between Russia or compromat when it comes to
Well, the Mueller report
Putin
said there
and,
probably
Trump.
was compromat, and that really is the thing. It could have been the PP tape, which we know about, but I doubt it was, because Trump is a germaphobe and there's a whole other story there. But there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Putin does have a hold over him. I mean, I personally put it down to the fact that he puts Putin on a pedestal in the same way that he puts Kim Jong on a pedestal, and Xi Jinping on a pedestal, and Viktor Orban on a pedestal, and Erdogan on a pedestal. He thinks that these people are the coolest. But you know, Mark, I think what we should talk about, because I'm looking at some of the messages that are coming up, you know, on your live chat. My position on this and your position on this is not partisan. It is patriotic. And I think that is the difference to make. We're not saying this because we're snowflake lefty liberals and we don't want the Republicans to win. I want the Republican Party to have fair representation. I want Republican voters to have fair representation that are conservative and that stick to those values. Trump isn't that. Right? He is not that. He is not a Republican. He's anti-conservative. He's anti-constitution. He's anti-institutions. He is not what the Republican or the grand old party, whatever you choose to call it, he is not that. And so what I'm advocating for is a healthy opposition to Kamala Harris, because I believe in opposition, because I think that that forms a functioning democracy, where you argue with each other and you find common ground, because that is true representation. But Trump is not that. He listens to nobody. He's out on his own. He calls the shots. He clearly is compromised by these dictatorships around the world, and that's what he has planned for the US. He does not care for his voters. He does not want to cut your taxes. He wants to cut corporation taxes. He doesn't believe in climate change. He didn't care for the pandemic because it happened the same year as the election and he wanted to win. So, you know, all of that stuff is the reason why Donald Trump needs to be gone. But replace him with somebody who is a quality conservative candidate. I'm not saying that this should be that this is not a partisan position. This is a patriot position because we love America and we care for what it stands for. He is none of those things.
It's interesting, and I see this in the chat as well, the flag of pacifism is sort of flown around Trump because he's against the conflict in Ukraine. And as a result, somehow he's been able to suggest, and there were no wars, is what he says, under my presidency. And of course, that's total BS. I mean, you had war in Yemen, you had war in Syria. These are wars that the United States is participating in. Okay, I'm not just saying that these are wars that exist out there somewhere.
Well, he killed Soleimani, so that was on his watch as well. And off the back of that, an airliner got shot down full of 200 Ukrainians. So, I mean, if that's not a war, I don't know what is.
The Soleimani thing came out of nowhere. I mean, in other words, it was unprovoked. And so he's lucky that didn't turn into some widespread conflict in the Middle East, that Iran didn't strike back. It was really on Iran's desire to avoid some sort of military conflict that Trump skated without there being any kind of reprisal.
Mm-hmm. And this is the problem that we have, is that he will lie through his veneers in order to convince people that he is good for America. But he just isn't. He's not a patriotic American. He's never cared for America. And you can go right back to 9/11 when his response was, well, now I've got the tallest building in town. And that is who Donald Trump is. Not even thinking for the effects of 9/11 on America, on New Yorkers, and on the victims and their families. All about him. And if you haven't learnt that, 9/11 was over 20 years ago, right? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like we have had this data on who this guy is. He hasn't changed. Yes, he's become older and his dementia's obviously kicking in, but I don't even care for the dementia. That, to me, is not the bad part of Donald Trump. The bad part of Donald Trump is the fascism, as Kamala Harris rightly came out yesterday and said with clarity, confirming that Mark Milley said he was a fascist, and John Kelly said he was a fascist, and James Mattis said he was a fascist. These are lifelong military generals, 4-star generals, Marine generals. It's like, don't take Kamala's word for it, take their word for it, because they've been keeping us safe for decades. So, I mean, to me, it's an open and shut case. But as you know, I have an opinion on the polling. I don't actually believe Donald Trump is going to win this election. I don't believe the separation is 1.5 or 6 points. I actually think that he's going to lose in a landslide. And I think that the fake polling suggests that it's close so that he can claim that it was rigged when he loses. And that's what we have to be prepared for.
This is a terrific point that Anthony Davis is making, and I just want to focus on it for a moment. There is a flood of GOP polling right now that suggests that Trump is ahead in all the swing states and is trending up in this very distinct, remarkable way. And Anthony Davis's narrative makes a lot of sense, which is, of course, the GOP is flooding the zone, as is now said over and over, with all of these polls that they're not independent polls, they're GOP polls. So, you kind of reverse engineer what you want, right? I want this poll to show that Trump is way ahead so that after the election, when he does lose, perhaps in a landslide, as Anthony Davis is suggesting, that there is this remarkable, well, wait a minute, this can't be legitimate because all of the polling showed, at worst it's close, and we were actually way, way ahead as GOP. So they really have set up, and they're really playing for Act Two, aren't they, Anthony Davis?
It's not just Act Two. This is a continuation, in my opinion, of the insurrection. The insurrection never stopped, right? So January 6th, yes, you're right, it was the rehearsal. They can see what they could get away with, what they couldn't get away with, who they could trust, who they couldn't trust. Mike Pence is out of the equation yet. The difference is Trump is not the incumbent, so that's going to change things, so they had to adjust their plan.
That's a huge difference, though, isn't it?
Huge difference. But it's not going to stop because a couple of things are at play. You've got people who are Trump loyalists, who are working in these legislatures, they're not quite fake electors, but it's their job to certify the election. there's a good chance that that won't be happening. I know that Georgia's actually clamped down on that recently, and it's been doing a lot of work because they know, and Brad Raffensperger knows, and Gabe knows, all these people there that have had to deal with what went on last time. They've tried to kind of belt and braces the operation. But, there's a lot of districts, there's a lot of swing states, and there's also a lot of Trump loyalists who think they can get away with it. I mean, look at the way those fake electors knocked on the door and said, we've got the new electing certificates and we'd like to swap them out. I mean, they actually did that, and there was like a policeman on the door and he's like, you ain't coming in. I mean, that is how blatant their activities will be, their illegal activities. That's how obvious the corruption is. I don't think they're particularly smart, these people. But, this time around, look, let me just say this. The American economy is doing great, right? It's really, considering we're off the back of a pandemic, when all other countries are still struggling to grow, America is doing really, really well. And that is a very important thing going into an election. People really do vote based on how the economy is doing. We're not in a recession. We never fell into recession. GDP is up, growth is up, unemployment is down, inflation is coming down. So, we're in a really good place. That on its own could win the Democrats the election. Just that on its own. Now add into the equation that the opposition, her opponent, is a convicted felon, 34 felony counts. He's twice impeached. He paid off a porn star. He stole classified documents. And he still claims that the election was stolen. Add all that stuff in, there is no way Trump's winning this election. He just isn't. But the reason that we feel like he might is because he tells us how popular he is. Mark, he's so unpopular, 2 people tried to shoot him from his own team, right? That is how unpopular this guy is. And so we have to accept that so much of this is our own insecurity, it's our own anxiety, and it's built up over, he's been around for 10 years now, almost a decade of Trump talking crap on America for 10 years. So it feels like he is more popular and that there is more energy for him than there is. But it's actually the fact that with a red hat you can see people, right? Look at the merchandise is that color on purpose because it looks like there's more of them, right?
Let me worry out loud for a lot of people who may not buy into that. I sure love that narrative and really hope it's true that somehow, when you stack up all of those things, that his support has eroded and people find him, at least in sufficient numbers, loathsome and would never vote for him. But let me just give you the other side, which is He is Teflon. These are insanely damaging things to which you referred. I mean, he's adjudicated rapist. He jacked thousands of documents from the White House. He was waving them around. I mean, these are classified military secrets. It's likely that they were shared with foreign powers. We know that because of any number of and any amount of reporting that's come out of Mar-a-Lago. Any number of reports is what I was going to say. That's without purpose. Like, to what purpose would you jack these military documents and secrets, store them in bathrooms, ballrooms, and bedrooms at Mar-a-Lago? So, and he engineered a coup, as you say. You stack all of these things up. However, none of these things seem to stick to him, Anthony Davis. I mean, objective polling does have him in a dead heat. It's not unreasonable to think that there is a possibility that this guy might actually win. Now, when you add to that this that you've referred to, which is that people who are counting the votes and certifying the votes may be, quote, in on it, if you will, I think there's a scary, real possibility that his core of support, let's say it's 35%, maybe it's 40% of Americans who are motivated by feeling as though they're losing their country. It's not a white enough country. It's not a religious enough country. There's a big Christian theocracy that is desired by a lot of people. Let's get this country back to Jesus. That supports him. These things can drag him across the finish line.
It's not 40%. So let's just look at the numbers for a second, because this is really important. It feels like it's 40% because when we look at the vote last time, he got 70 million votes, right? Or 74 million votes. And what did Biden get? Like 86 million votes. Well, there was 7,000 votes in it, I think. So it feels like it's half and half. But let's just look at some of the numbers. Only 63% of the electorate voted last time. So the turnout is abysmal, considering that democracy is hanging by a thread. So now you're not talking about 330 million people. You're actually talking about much smaller numbers. So, and the other thing is that Donald Trump hasn't won anything since 2016. He is a serial loser. He won in 2016 because people gave him the benefit of the doubt. They knew him from The Apprentice. He hadn't done January 6 yet. He hadn't done the coup. He hadn't stolen the documents yet. He hadn't paid off Stormy Daniels, or we certainly didn't know about it then. He hadn't have tried to overturn the election. He hadn't have called, he hadn't done Pocahontas. He hadn't done Horseface. All of this stuff, right? All this crap that we've been dealing with. None of that had happened in 2016. So people were looking at Trump through rose-tinted spectacles. But since those things started to happen, since his failure to control COVID, I mean, the scientists reckon that 600,000 people died unnecessarily in COVID because of Donald Trump. And 1.2 million people died in total in the US. Donald Trump is a pox on American society. He hasn't won anything since that became clear. So, I see where you're coming from, but statistically, the numbers do not suggest that he wins. There are simply not enough people who are dumb enough to vote for Donald Trump. And the line I'm peddling now is that, nobody in their right mind will vote for Donald Trump. Now, that is a loaded sentence on purpose, exactly. Right? It is a purposely loaded sentence. Nobody in their right mind is going to vote for Donald Trump.
There are interest and single-issue voters. There are anti-abortion voters. But there are also, women, I think, who are going to show up in large numbers who have seen their reproductive rights stripped away. I mean, it's crazy, the jihad that's gone on against women, and it will continue, and they will double down on it. So I get this on both sides, but what I'm seeing in the chat, and I think it's a reasonable thing to ask is, so wait a minute, let me understand this. Why then is the polling, objective polling? I mean, if you look at the Real Clear Politics aggregator polls, there is a dead heat. It's within the margin of error. Are those polls just out to lunch, or is this an unpolled group of people who will be voting for Kamala Harris over Trump?
Well, firstly, give me an example of when polls have ever been correct, right? They've never been correct. They're famously incorrect. They just give the rolling news network something to talk about. But there is very little accuracy in polling, traditionally. It worked better decades ago when everybody had a landline and people actually answered it and they didn't have caller ID and they didn't have 6 jobs, so they actually had time on their hands. It was different when that kind of polling was invented. These days, the pollsters have to be a little bit more strategic. They have to come up with new methodologies. I personally don't believe that the types of people that will be voting for Kamala Harris and the Democrats are the ones that show up in polling. They just don't. There's also a whole lot of Republicans who are going to say that they're Republicans when the pollster rings the bell, but they're actually going to vote for the Democrat this time around because they care more about this country than they do about one burnt orange disaster.
We talked about this yesterday. Kim and I were talking about the fact that I think women in a lot of these MAGA households or MAGA-adjacent households will show up at the polls and pull the lever or punch the card for Kamala Harris because they resent the fact that Trump and his minions of older white men are jumping on them and taking away their reproductive freedoms. But Kim mentioned that in many a MAGA household, they fill out the ballot together, with the sort of supervision, the proctoring of the election ballot by the guy, the family member who is into Trump's perceived machismo, etc. Yeah. Go ahead, what?
Well, because this unfortunately is baked into the Christian nationalism, which is that the men are dominant, the female is designed to rear children and clean the house and cook, and tragically, in a lot of these families, people are defaulting to those roles, and it's just a very antiquated way of living. And I recognize that we live in a society, it's not like the Amish community where they don't go on the internet, so they don't know how other people live. I do believe that there is pushback because we recognize what a truly modern, progressive, equal society can look like. Look, we've got a female person of color running for president who is going to win. So, we really have already broken the glass ceiling. But what goes with that is you having access to more rights, not fewer rights. And by rights, I even include the Environmental Protection Agency, the right to breathe clean air and drink clean water. These are human rights, basic human rights. Abortion should be a given as a human right. It shouldn't even be up for discussion.
Control your own body absolutely should be a human right. I have many friends, Cabo Jeff says, that are good people who really think Trump was sent to us to save the country. Cabo Jeff, you need to make new friends, I would say, first of all.
But that is a very popular opinion amongst people who are radicalized by Trumpism. And Dr. Bandy Lee says that Trumpism is a contagion. It is a collective mental health crisis that a lot of people are suffering from because he is the antithesis of everything that you think. And he's never told a true word in his life. He is the most ungodly person. And so to convert with your mind somebody as terrible as that, with the Access Hollywood stuff and all that, and to think that he is a gift from God who has been sent here as a kind of rising Messiah, that is quite a stretch. It can only be a mental health problem.
It's a pitch, though. It's a pitch that I think, again, rising theocrats and those who want a theocracy, it's a pitch to their minions, to their congregations, that this is the guy, the imperfect vessel that God has chosen for his perfect work. You know how you can work the Bible, and you can make anything. You can absolutely make any sale you want in any pitch using the Bible or whatever kind of twisted logic. JH says, I'm a centrist and going to vote for Trump because Trump will stop anti-Semitism on college campuses. Let me first say this. Trump can't stop anti-Semitism on college campuses. I mean, who do you think he is? I mean,
he's anti-Semitic for a start. He is. Trump is the most anti-Semitic person who's ever been in leadership next to Enoch Powell. And if you can't see that, if you don't know that, then you really need to check yourself and do some research. And, it's very interesting because I was watching, I don't know if you've seen, but David Pakman, who's one of our kind of colleagues in this independent news space, who's brilliant. He's been debating a lot of Republicans recently. And it's clear to me, and a lot of these Republicans have their own podcasts because, people give themselves a podcast. And the lack of knowledge that these people seem to have, he's been very respectful and he schools people. And a lot of them are like, really? I didn't know that. And this is what we need to do, is we need to correct people where if you think that Donald Trump is on the side or is not an anti-Semite, why? Because he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? I mean, is that it? Because that caused a whole lot of problems and destabilized much of Israel because of that move. Not everybody was down for that. He lied about bringing peace to the Middle East. He did the Abraham Accords, which are a bunch of fake...
it was a real estate deal, really.
It was a real estate deal, but it didn't include the Palestinians.
Exactly.
Right? All the negotiations involved countries, Jordan, places that weren't even in conflict. It was a photo op. That's all it was. In the same way that him going to McDonald's and serving food through the window, the second window, I might add, they didn't put him on the first window because they didn't trust him to handle the cash. But it was a photo op. The place was closed. All the people on the drive-thru were Republicans that had been hand-selected. Nothing that you see with Donald Trump is real. It is fake. And maybe we could just flip this very quickly. It's important to say, and I made this point in a couple of videos recently, that the difference between Trump and Kamala Harris is authenticity. America is already great. Kamala Harris has been able to bring people from all sides of the aisle and from all over the country and make them feel a sense of hope and joy for a change and a new direction for a positive America where we are not at each other's throats. That is the greatness that America has. That is, in my opinion, what is going to win this election. She says we're not going back. She makes a very good point. Nobody wants to go back to that. My memory of Trump's presidency was the National Guard on the street, shops boarded up, women's marches, BLM protests. That was my memory of the Trump administration. And I'm not going back. And I don't even get to vote.
It is, that's wild, too, that you don't get to vote. Well, you'll get your citizenship soon, though, I think, won't you?
Yeah, in like a 20 months
soon
or
enough.
something. 20 months.
Yeah, right now. Well, if you live in California, it won't matter on the presidential side, but it might on other House races, etc. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.